Morocco by R. Riviere, Great Queen Street, with the Duport arms blocked in gold on the front. Despite a few passages where the author's hand deteriorates, apparently under psychological duress or perhaps as a result of his opium habit, there are relatively few deletions, additions, or other amendments. In addition to the author's narrative, there are several interpolated documents and extracts by other hands. I have made a number of silent amendments in matters of orthography, punctuation, and so on, and because the manuscript lacks a title, I have used a phrase from one of the prefatory quotations, the source of which is a poem, appropriately enough, from the pen of P. Rainsford Daunt himself. I have also supplied titles for each of the 5 parts, and for the 5 sections of the so-called intermezzo. The sometimes enigmatic Latin titles to the 47 sections or chapters have been retained. Their idiosyncrasy seemed typical of this author, though I have provided translations. On the first leaf of the manuscript are a dozen or so quotations from Owen Feltham's Resolves, some of which I have used as epigraphs to each of the 5 parts. J. Antrobus, Professor of Post-Authentic Victorian Fiction, University of Cambridge.
The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawn swords. Psalm 55, verse 21. I find to him that the tale is told, belief only makes the difference betwixt a truth and a lie. Owen Feltham, Resolves or Excogitations, a 2nd Century, 1628, 4, of Lies and Untruths. For death is the meaning of night, the eternal shadow into which all lives must fall, all hopes expire. P. Rainsford Daunt, from the Persian, Rosamundi and Other Poems, 1854. To my unknown reader, ask not Pilate's question, for I have sought not truth, but meaning. E. G. Part the First. Death of a Stranger. October to November, 1854. What a skein of ruffled silk is the uncomposed man. Owen Feltham, Resolves, 1623, 2, of Resolution. 1. Exordium. An introduction to a treatise or discourse. After killing the red-haired man, I took myself off to Quinn's for an oyster supper. It had been surprisingly, almost laughably easy. I had followed him for some distance after first observing him in Threadneedle Street. I cannot say why I decided it should be him, and not one of the others on whom my searching eye had alighted that evening. I had been walking for an hour or more in the vicinity with one purpose, to find someone to kill. Then I saw him, outside the entrance to the bank, amongst a huddle of pedestrians waiting for the crossing sweeper to do his work. Somehow he seemed to stand out from the crowd of identically dressed clerks and city men streaming forth from the premises. He stood regarding the milling scene around him, as if turning something over in his mind. I thought for a moment that he was about to retrace his steps. Instead, he pulled on his gloves, moved away from the crossing point, and set off briskly. A few seconds later, I began to follow him. We proceeded steadily westwards through the raw October cold and the thickening mist. After descending Ludgate Hill and crossing over into Fleet Street, we continued on our course for some distance until, at length, and after having refreshed himself at a coffee-house, my man turned into a narrow court that cut through to the Strand, not much more than a passage, flanked on either side by high, windowless walls. I glanced up at the discoloured sign, Cane Court, then stopped for a moment to remove my gloves and take out the long-bladed knife from the inside pocket of my greatcoat. My victim, all unsuspecting, continued on his way. But before he had time to reach the steps at the far end, I had caught up with him noiselessly and had sunk my weapon deep into his neck. I had expected him to fall instantly forwards with the force of the blow, but, curiously, he dropped to his knees with a soft gasp, his arms by his side, his stick clattering to the floor, and remained in that position for some seconds, like an enraptured devotee before a shrine. As I withdrew the knife, I moved forward slightly. It was then I noticed for the first time that his hair, where it showed beneath his hat, was, like his neatly trimmed whiskers, a distinct shade of red. For a brief moment, before he gently collapsed sideways, he looked at me. Not only looked at me, but, I swear, smiled, though in truth I now suppose it was the consequence of some involuntary spasm brought about by the withdrawal of the blade. He lay, illuminated by a narrow shaft of pale yellow light flung out by the gas lamp at the top of the passage steps, in a slowly widening pool of dark blood that contrasted oddly with the carroty hue of his hair and whiskers. He was dead, for certain. I stood for a moment, looking about me. A sound, perhaps somewhere behind me in the dark recesses of the court. Had I been observed? No. All was still. Putting on my gloves once more, I dropped the knife down a grating and walked smartly away, down the dimly lit steps and into the enfolding, anonymous bustle of the Strand. Now I knew that I could do it. But it gave me no pleasure. The poor fellow had done me no harm. Luck had simply been against him, together with the colour of his hair, which I now saw had been his fatal distinction. His way that night, inauspiciously coinciding with mine in Threadneedle Street, had made him the unwitting object of my irrevocable intention to kill someone. But had it not been him, it must have been someone else. Until the very moment in which the blow had been struck, I had not known definitively that I was capable of such a terrible act, and it was absolutely necessary to put the matter beyond all doubt, for the dispatching of the red-haired man was in the nature of a trial or experiment, to prove to myself that I could indeed take another human life and escape the consequences. When I next raised my hand in anger, it must be with the same swift and sure determination, but this time it would be directed not at a stranger, but at the man I call my enemy. And I must not fail. The first word I ever heard used to describe myself was resourceful. It was said by Tom Grexby, my dear old schoolmaster, to my mother. They were standing beneath the ancient chestnut tree that shaded the little path that led up to our house. I was tucked away out of view above them, nestled snugly in a cradle of branches I called my crow's nest. From here I could look out across the cliff-top to the sea beyond, dreaming for long hours of sailing away one day to find out what lay beyond the great arc of the horizon. On this particular day, hot, still and silent, I watched my mother as she walked down the path towards the gate, a little lace parasol laid open against her shoulder. Tom was panting up the hill from the church as she reached the gate. I had not long commenced under his tutelage, and supposed that my mother had seen him from the house and had come out expressly to speak to him about my progress. "He is," I heard him say in reply to her inquiry, "a most resourceful young man." Later I asked her what resourceful meant. "It means you know how to get things done," she said, and I felt pleased that this appeared to be a quality approved of in the adult world. "Was Papa resourceful?" I asked. She did not reply, but instead told me to run along and play, as she must return to her work. When I was very young, I was often told, gently but firmly, by my mother to run along, and consequently spent many hours amusing myself. In summer I would dream amongst the branches of the chestnut tree, or, accompanied by Beth, our maid-of-all-work, explore along the shoreline beneath the cliff. In winter, wrapped up in an old tartan.